Welcome back. We are going to be taking a quick intro into CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. Just like the name implies, it is mainly used for styling. It is used to beautify our web page or add styles to any element on our web page. We are going to be learning how to apply CSS and how to write CSS. So first and first, let's learn how we can apply our CSS. There are three ways to actually apply CSS. We have the inline, the internal, and the external. The inline CSS, we've already done something on the inline CSS when I use the style attribute. So the inline CSS is the type of CSS written inline using the style attribute. Why the internal CSS is the type of CSS we write using the style tag. The external CSS is the type of CSS which we create a different file for the CSS and then we link it to our HTML document. Remember one thing, your CSS is meaningless without your HTML because you cannot style something that does not exist. Remember, HTML creates the main page, it creates the main element on the page. It is the skeleton of our web page. The CSS just adds flesh to that skeleton. Without the skeleton, the flesh is kind of useless. So let's get down to business and see how we can add CSS to our web page. We are going to be taking each of them from the inline to the internal to the external. But first, let's talk about the inline. To explain CSS better, I'm going to be creating two button tag and a paragraph tag. So I'm going to this one submit. We're going to copy and paste this. Maybe let's just make this join us. Okay, I think that is good. So let's make an H1 just for additional purposes. Okay, I can make an H1. Maybe I'll say header one, header one. So I think that is enough tags. So now let's start applying CSS to this. First up, let's talk about the inline CSS. I explained that the inline CSS is the type of CSS we write using the style attribute. From our previous class, I've explained what attributes are. Attributes are like extra information given to a tag. So I used the style attribute as an example in our previous class. I'm still going to reuse it again. Now I'm going to give more explanation on it. So now to use the inline CSS, we need the style attribute. We go to the elements which we wish to style. Currently now I want to style my H1. So I'll use the style attribute. Note the difference between a tag and an attribute. This is the tag and this is the attribute. This is an attribute rather. So now we get the style attribute. Now usual what I told you in our previous class, most attributes are equals to something and style is one of those attributes that must be assigned a value. So now the value that this style attribute will take is CSS code. So now we need to get something called a property. Any style you wish to add to an element as far as in context of CSS, it is called a property. Any style which you wish to apply, maybe you want to change the color, color is a property. You want to change the background, background is a property. You want to change the width, you want to change the width or you want to add width, width is a property. So any style which you wish to apply to an element in context of your CSS, it is called a property. So now I want to change the color. So by default, the color of text on my web page is black. So I want to change it. So I'm going to use the color property. So color. So right now I've gotten the property that I need. Now I need to put a column. This column will serve like, let's say, an equals to. Let's just call it an equals to. Let's say color should be equals to, let's say I want it to be blue, but now I'm just using the normal name. Then I need to add something now. I need to add a semicolon. Most people call this a period. Usually, it's used to show where a particular line ends in programming. So a period just to show that this particular property has ended here. So when I save this, and if I should run this, so let me copy part. Now you can see something. The color here is blue. Remember, the default is black, meaning it's going to go black by default. But because of this CSS I wrote here, I've been able to make the color blue. I can add other property. Maybe I want to change the background color. So I can go for the background color property. Now, one thing about our property, whenever you want to, when your property is made up of two words, never add a space. Your property cannot actually have a space. Every property has been predefined actually, but so you will not make mistake, there should be no space. So now I can make this let's make this red. So now when I reload, now you see the background here is red while the color of the text is blue. Am I kind of flowing? This is what we can achieve with CSS. This is how we apply inline CSS. Any property we want to attach, we are going to just write it inline using the style attribute. During the course of this course, we are going to learn many attributes and we are going to understand how to use CSS efficiently. So without further delay, let's proceed to the next type of CSS, or the next way, the second way of applying CSS, which is internal CSS. So internal CSS is the type of CSS we do using the style tag. So remember I told you to know the difference between an attribute and a tag. This is an attribute and this is the style attribute here. And now what I'm about to create now is the style tag. This is the style tag and this is the style attribute. So now just for proper organization, I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it in my head. That is the best practice. Always put your style in your head. So now what I need to do now is for me to be able to style any element, I need to call that element. I need to call the element I wish to style. So now I wish to style my body. So what I need to do, the name of the body tag is body. So I need to call it in my CSS. So now I'll call body. Then now I'll put my curly bracket. I don't know any other thing that might call this bracket, but the only term I think I can refer to it as is curly bracket. So we get our curly bracket. This curly bracket will serve as like a parenthesis or something like that. It's going to like every property we are going to attach in here is going to be assigned to the body. So now let's say now I want to change the background color. I can like go for the background color. Still the same syntax. We get the property, we get the column which I told you is like an equals to here. Then we want to assign a value and then we'll put a period to show that this line actually ended here. So now let's say now I want the color to be black. Right now I'm using normal color names, but as we proceed we'll start using something called color codes. So now this is black. So now let's save this and run this on our browser. We can see the body is now black because of I added I changed the color property, the background color property to black. So we can add other properties. There are many properties that we can add, but this is the way we write our inline CSS. Even if I want to style another element now, all I have to do is to call that element. If I want to style the button here, all I have to do is to call the button. So now when I call the button, I can add any property which I wish. I can increase the font size. So let me say I want the font size to be like 40 40 is too big. Let's say 20 pixels. So I want to go for 20 pixels. And when I reload, you can see the font size of the text is kind of increasing. It kind of increased. But notice something. I called the button, but both of them answered. It's just like entering into a classroom and calling for Emmanuel. Everybody that's answering Emmanuel will stand up. That is same thing we have here. I called only one button, but all the button on my page actually answered, and this property I attached to it was applied to both of them. As you can see, both of them seem bigger because the text in it actually, the font size has been increased. So now that's to tell you that once you call an element, every element that goes by that name is going to answer. So now I could actually maybe increase the width. So I could use the width property and be like, okay, now I want the width to be like 200 pixels. That's 200 pixels. So when I reload, you see 200 pixels. The style is being applied to both of them. So now I can make other thing. Maybe I want the color to be white. White. And I want the background so that they can be able to differentiate between the text and the background. So now I want the background color to be um let's go for red again. So that is what we have. You can see where we are heading. We are kind of styling this button. I can actually increase the height. Height is another property on this one. So I can be like height and actually make it okay. Now I want like 70 pixels, kind of going big. I could like reduce it and be like, no, I want it to be 20. 20 is too small. I can be like, okay, let's go 50. So you see, one thing about front end development is mostly try and error. You just keep trying and trying till you get what you're actually looking for. So you can see there is a line outside this button. I can actually remove it. It's called a border. So I just need to add a border property. Border, I can set it to 0, meaning I don't want any border. This outline, the outline on any box as far as in context of your web page is called a border. So you can see that border is no longer there. So in our next class we'll be discussing something called box model, and we'll discuss more about borders. But now let's focus on learning how to actually apply CSS, write and apply CSS. So now I've been able to actually style my button and give it a more classy look. So we are through with the internal CSS, the inline CSS. So now let's go to the external CSS. You can remember how to do the inline CSS. We use the inline CSS mostly when we don't have much code to write. Like maybe we just want to change something. Maybe not like we don't want to add that much property. You understand? Internal CSS is mostly used when you don't have much content on your page like we have now. But external CSS, as I told you, is the type of CSS we do with an external file, an external CSS file. We use it for big projects. So what I have to do now is to come here and create a file for my CSS. So I might name this style dot css. Remember to always add an extension. I explained this in our previous class that extensions are very important. They tell the computer how to run a particular file. So .css is the file extension or file format of a CSS file. So now I just enter. So now the next thing to do is to actually properly link my CSS file to my HTML file, because remember what I told you, CSS is actually meaningless without the HTML. So to link it properly, all we have to do is to use the link tag. So we go link. VS Code has actually given us an autocomplete. So the link tag is one of those tags that actually needs attribute to work, just like the image tag. When I explained that the image tag needs to have the source attribute as well as the alternative attribute to work perfectly. That is same thing with the link tag. The link tag, in order to link our CSS properly, we need to add this attribute and the href attribute. We need to add the rel attribute and the href attribute. So let's try to write this. So I'll get the link. So it is a void tag, no need, it does not have a closing tag. So now the first attribute I want to add is the rel. Like I think this is short for relation, like what type of file are we trying to link here. So I'm trying to link a style sheet, so I'm going to write style sheet. Because of CSS is a style sheet from the name. Then now I need to get the href. The href is an attribute that does same work as the source attribute. Both of them are used to show the location of a file. So right now I need to trace the location of my CSS file. So now my CSS file is actually in this same folder where I'm working on. So I'll just put one dot, then a slash, then I'll now click on my I'll now add the name of my CSS file. So right now let me just copy this button. Let me control exit. Let me save. So you see the difference. See the button is back to normal because I've actually copied whatever I've cut whatever was applying those styles and properties. So now let me paste them in my external CSS file, and when I save it and run it, you see the styles are back again because I've properly linked this CSS file to my HTML document. So now doing external CSS is just same as doing internal CSS, same syntax for writing CSS. The only difference is that you have to do this in a separate file and then link it. While the internal CSS, you actually do it in that same file, but it's same syntax. You don't need to change anything. The first thing you need to do is to call the element you want to style. After calling it, you put your curly brackets, then you start attaching the property which you want to add to that element. So now notice something, a behavior that happened as I explained earlier, that once I call an element, especially with the tag name, every element that answers that same name or that goes by that same tag would actually answer. Like the property I will add will be applied to all of them. But what if in a situation that I want to have different style even though they are same element? For example, I have two buttons on my page, but I want the styles for both of them to actually be different. But I don't want to change the fact that both of them are button. Now, our previous class, I explained to you an attribute called class and ID. Both of them are used to give like a nickname to elements. So now I can give a class to my button. Let me say I give this button a class. Then I'll set it to let's say this button is for submit. So let me just say submit. So I'll give it a class. So now what I have to do now is to call this instead of calling the button. Now I can easily call the class. Now let me save my HTML file, then go to my CSS. So now here I'm just going to clean this. So now to call a class is different from calling a normal tag. The first thing we need to do is to put a dot. When we put a dot, then we'll put the name of the class. So sorry for that. We put a dot, then the class that we just created. So the class I created is submit. So let's put submit here. Now when I save this and if I should rerun my browser, you will see the star is only got applied to one because of this submit class was only added to one. So meaning that the styles can only be applied to the one that answered. So now I can equally give something called an ID. An ID almost work the same thing as a class. It's almost same with a class. Rather, there is just more restriction with using the ID. I prefer using the ID for only one case stuff, or maybe when I actually want to get that element in my JavaScript. So now to use the ID, it is very simple. Just same as using the class. We get the ID attribute, then we give our nickname. So I might want to name this one join then underscore us. Now notice something about giving a class name or an ID. You should not add space. If I should add space between those two things, this is practically wrong. Very, very wrong. You do not add space in your class name or your IDs. If you should add space, the browser is going to see them as two different names. It's going to see it as join and us instead of join us. So you want to, instead of using the space, you want to add an underscore to show that the two words are actually together. So we use an underscore. So right now I save it. So what I need to do, I go to my CSS. So now to call a class is also, sorry, to call an ID is also different from a class. To call a class, you need to add a dot before you call the name. To call an ID, you need to add a hash. So you add a hash, then now the ID is join underscore us. So I'm going to put my curly brackets. So now I need to add the properties that I want. So practically I want to add almost same property. So now I want the font to be 20 pixels. I want the width to be 200 pixels. I want the color. I don't want the color to be white. Rather, I want the color to be blue. Let's try that one. I want the color to be blue. Then I want the background to be transparent. Then another thing I want, have something called border width. Right now, just don't bother yourself on the property. We have something called border width. So I'm going to add something called border width. So let's say the border width I want it to be 5 pixels. I'm going to add something called border style. There's actually a shortcut for this property that I'm using. Instead of using border with border style, I can just use border, but I want to use each of them individually so you will get them. So in our next class, it will be easier to actually talk about. So there are different style I can add to my border. I've already explained to you what a border is. A border is an outline at an outline showing the end of any box. An outline on any box. So there are different border style. So but the one I usually go for is solid. So now I need to add the border color, meaning a color for my border. So the border color. So I'm going to go with that same blue. So when I save it and when I reload, you can see how my button looks like. Looking good, right? So I've been able to use CSS to style my button. I can see how gorgeous it's looking. So we can actually continue with this. So right now you see me like I'm repeating my CSS kind of calling font size like for that same kind of elements, and I'm kind of repeating my CSS code. This is not professional. Instead of me repeating my CSS code, I should look for a way to actually optimize my page more and make my code shorter. So right now, the fact that I added a class to them on an ID does not change the fact that it's still button. So I can still refer to both of them as button. So I can come up here and call button. Now the styles I add to this button is going to be attached or assigned to all the buttons on my page. When no notice something, when I want to call the tag, like the tag, or call an element by the tag name, I don't add a dot or a hash. The dot is for classes and the hash is for ID. So right now I can decide, okay, let's go for font size. Since all my buttons are using a font size of 20 pixels, I can do font size 20 pixels. Now I can clean it here as well as delete it from here. So I know all my buttons also use a width of 200 pixels. So I'm going to go 200 pixels. I can also delete it. I know that my buttons are using a height of 50 pixels, so I'm going to just cut this and I'm going to paste it here. So remember to add your period. So I can also clean it here as well as clean this. So when I save it, and if I should run it, you see we still have the same output because of I just made my code more easier, more simpler to actually understand. The the style or the property that I want every button on my page to actually have, I assign them to the button element. But when I want to be more specific, I use a class or an ID. So this is all we are going to be discussing today in relation to CSS. So this is what I've talked about, how we can apply CSS and what CSS actually is, the different methods